Hi everyone, my name is Lucy Truman. I'm the Managing Director of Truman Change. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we are expecting a couple more people, but we'll make a start and we'll just let people in as and when they get here. So thank you very much for joining us. We are a small management consultancy. We help mainly public sector organisations to plan and deliver change. And we started running these change chats during the summer, really, as a response to all the change that was happening to do with COVID. And we just felt that it was really important to have a bit of time to reflect on what was happening, on how organisations were managing that change, and to give people the chance to hear from people from different sectors, really, because I think one of the things that's been quite unique about COVID is that it has impacted all of us in some way. So I think it's something that's quite easy to do some cross-sector learning on. And we've run a few of these sessions, and then that were a bit generic about just, how change has happened, and then we've started to run some themed ones. And the reason really we wanted to take the chance to reflect on learning was because we know that it's really important to do change well, because when organisations do it well, amazing things happen. When they don't do so well, things happen that cost money, cost time, cost morale. There is a real kind of emotional impact to change done badly, and I'm sure other colleagues on the call will have experienced going into organisations and people talking about a change journey that happened 5 years ago that they're still bitter about because it didn't go very well. And I thought that really this year has given us a really unique opportunity to learn from organisations about how change can be done extremely quickly in extremely difficult circumstances, and also that kind of practical application. So we've spoken to lots of people from different sectors in different positions about how change actually happened on the ground, rather than the theory behind it, which has been really interesting. So the format of today, it's the same as always. It's an informal session. We've got some panel members. We're going to just answer some questions and just debate and share learning. I would ask that participants do try and stay muted, just so that we don't have lots of background noise. We will be taking questions through the chat function though, so please do type any questions in there and we'll try to cover them as best we can. We are recording the session, but we only publish the audio of it, so don't worry about what you look like. It is just the actual audio that we put out onto YouTube afterwards. So today's theme is bringing people together. And the reason why we wanted to do a session specifically on this theme was that we found, speaking to organisations about the impact of COVID, that those who already had really good partnerships in place were successful. And that there is something about breaking down those barriers between organisations. People had to pull together, regardless of what organisation they were from, and work together to make a difference, whether that was in the health service, whether it was in local government, whether it was in the private sector. We've seen a lot of organisations that might not have worked together quite as well before pulling together to make stuff happen this year. And I think whether it's formal mergers, whether it's just partnerships or shared services, there is something about bringing people from different teams and organisations together which presents a set of challenges around change. And that can be to do with a sense of identity, where people feel that they belong, which organisation they feel aligned to. It can be around processes and ways of working, and it can be around culture. So there are some unique challenges, I think, when you're trying to get people to collaborate and work together from different places, that I think is definitely worth a conversation. And I also think, and this is just my view, that we're going to see more of this in the future. So my background is local government. There's a lot of conversations going on at the moment about local government reorganisation. I think in the private sector over the next year or two, we'll see more mergers and acquisitions. I think that in the public sector generally, it's really important for us to break down some of those barriers between organisations. There's lots of work going on in health and social care. So I feel that this way of working, of merging or partnerships, I think is something that we'll see more and more of in the future. And also, just on a personal level, it's my favourite type of project. I really, really enjoy working in this particular type of project, and that's because I just find it really fascinating. I find that whole cultural clash of different organisations really, really interesting. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. So we have a great panel to share with you today. We have Georgia Turner, who is the Head of Marketing and Comms and Organisational Development at BCP, which is a new council in Bournemouth, which was set up in April last year. And that was as a result of a process of bringing together 9 councils into 2. So lots of hard work there around bringing people from different organisations together. So lots of learning to share with us there, I'm sure. We have Karen Kyle, who's a System Programme Director from Bay Health and Care Partners Integrated Care Partnership. Lots of experience there around building in system-wide partnerships between health and social care, which is something that lots of areas around the country are working really hard to do. So that whole, grey area between health and local government, and how do we bring that together and work together really well. And we also have Ket Patel, who specialises in change and transformation. He is the UK co-lead for the Change Management Institute, which I am a member of, and he does lots of work for the change management community. He spent much of his early career focusing on technology projects which were driven by mergers and acquisitions, and he's currently working as a consultant with Marlowe Consulting. But he has worked in both the public and private sector, just helping people in different departments and organisations to work together more collaboratively. So again, lots of learning to share there. So Georgia, am I okay to kick off with you? Just tell us a little bit about your journey and what you've learned so far at BCP with this process of bringing everybody together.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So I'll give you a little bit of background in that this started in, I think it was September 2015. We literally had 3 days. We were told that there'd been political discussions behind the scenes and we wanted to make an announcement in 3 days' time. So that's how not to start it, I would probably say. But it did get the press on board, and it did get us a lot of coverage. And that's when effectively the Southeast Dorset part of Dorset, so Bournemouth Council as it was, Poole Council, Christchurch Council, which was a district, a 2-tier, the lower tier at the time, and East Dorset District Council leaders made a statement that they believed that a single unitary council for that part of Dorset was the right thing to do for residents, because budgets are getting tighter, services are getting squeezed, there's no prospect of any more money. It would be more efficient, and actually not just that, it would give us a greater voice nationally, because we would be greater than the sum of our parts, to use a bit of a phrase. We would be one of the largest local authorities in the country, and therefore very much able to punch above the collective weight that they were able to previously. We then moved to the politics of it. Some politicians were for it, some politicians were not for it, and that was a constant, I would say, very, not even undercurrent, a very overcurrent really, that ran throughout the whole process of political changes, leadership changes, changes of position of various councils along the line, because this wasn't just about Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole and then East Dorset. It had to be about all of Dorset. We had to create something that worked for the whole county, not just for us, because Dorset County Council was the upper tier council for East Dorset and Christchurch. So it wasn't a case of Bournemouth and Poole. The easy thing to do would have been Bournemouth and Poole, 2 unitary councils, saying, we're just going to merge because we're already running all the services together. That would have been the easy thing to do. But not necessarily the right thing to do for local people and for the options. So the first thing we had to do was a huge exercise which we called Reshaping Your Councils, which was a county-wide huge consultation process. So that involved road shows, it involved self-selecting surveys, but most importantly it involved a proper quantitative sampling, which we got an external agency in to manage independently for us, to run that entire consultation engagement with the business community, with key partners and with residents, to come up with the recommended case for us. So we had 4 options at the time. It was a Bournemouth and Poole merger, with the rest of Dorset another unitary council. It was Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole with the rest of Dorset another unitary council. It was Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole and East Dorset, with the rest of Dorset having a single council. And it was no change. There was an option of no change was on the table. So consultation was a huge thing for us. That took months and months to do that properly, as you would imagine. That led to a conclusion where we got a recommended case for Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole and the rest of Dorset, 2 unitary councils. We then had to start the case of getting government to agree that, putting the case across, getting it through all the councils, which was by no means easy. Not all councils agreed it, not all councils signed up to it. So that was, and didn't right until, almost months before the councils were created, we still had one local authority that was not signed up, did not want it to happen. And then we had to submit a business case to government, who said, if you get your business case to us in January, we'll give you a decision in February. They meant the same year. It took them 13 months. So we ended up having to create basically a £1.6 billion merger in 13 months, when we thought we would have had about 2.5 years. So that was challenging. And that's enough. I won't say any more because I'm sure it will come out later. But yeah, now we've got 2 councils in Dorset and it's great.
Thank you, Georgia. Karen, do you want to tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, hi. So just a little bit background about Morecambe Bay. So for people who don't know where that is and the geography of it, so Morecambe Bay covers North Lancashire and South Cumbria, which is Morecambe, Lancaster, Barrow and Furness and South Lakeland. It's a geography of 1,000 square miles and a population of 360,000, and a real mix of rural and urban communities. So this actually starts back in 2012, actually, way before I started. I've been in this post for 2 years, where the health economy came together to develop a clinical strategy to improve healthcare provision across Morecambe Bay, but really recognise really quickly that to improve healthcare, you need to engage with your social care partners, your district councils, your ambulance services, but more importantly, communities. So as that started and progressed, the system developed a strategy, Better Care Together it's called, for Morecambe Bay, and that's the journey we've been on since 2012. I think the partnership changed over that time as partners came in and out, and we've got kind of 8 really key partners now, which are our county councils, our district councils, our voluntary and community faith sector, and more importantly, our community itself alongside healthcare. And what we're trying to do here is to actually embed the strategy, but we've not been a formal merger, we're a partnership with a collective agreement to work in partnership with a key set of core values, aims and priorities. And that's probably been the most challenging, I think, really, and we'll probably get into that in some of the questions around how do you align a value set base that's different across partner organisations and resonates with your communities. How do you bring those kind of senior leaders together to drive the ambition around improving health and care for our communities? I think over the last few months, since we've hit the pandemic, I think what we're striving to do probably for the last 2 years since I came into post around really transforming health and care, we've been able to move strides just because we've taken away the bureaucracy. We've been able to come together as partners because we had really strong relationships already. We've aligned our workforce in different ways, and it's just been really, really empowering. The difficult bit, I think, for us now going forward will be how do we sustain that when we've got a workforce that's tired, and people are worried about that, and how do we start to make sure we support each other, both as system leaders, our communities and our workforce together. And I think that's some of the challenge we've got going forward. That's a really brief resume of what's going on in Morecambe Bay. Is that okay, Lucy?
That's perfect, thank you. And Kat, do you want to tell us a bit about your work in the world of partnerships and mergers and working together?
Yeah, morning everyone. So I hail from the road of project management on many years back around technology projects driven by organizations that were merging different systems together. So there was quite a big, 2010, quite a big look at trying to bring lots of technology. I was in finance, lots of technology companies bringing together to bring technology and finance under one umbrella. And the work I found myself doing was trying to bring diverse cultures from two different organizations together with the benefit of some merged kind of offer from technology companies. So what I found was always missing was a desire to understand the backgrounds of where these people have come from. And so, their experiences, why processes were the way they were. It was almost that sort of, if you were being acquired, you knew better than the person you were acquiring. And that kind of attitude felt wrong. So in my role as kind of a project manager, I felt like there had to be a coming together of equals. So I spent a lot of my time, and this is sort of where I really discovered the aspects of change management, which is to kind of co-create what that future state should look like. I mean, I really got quite a bug for it in just not in those things, but in projects. Like if you look at most projects, the way a project is run is to then hand over to some users with some level of support. Maybe great where change management's been heavily invested, but maybe not so great where it's not. And the sort of tagline for a lot of execs when I was speaking to them was, well, how are you going to realize your benefits? Right. So this whole kind of dynamic of co-creating things, realizing benefits, and the project structure that you used, for me, there was just something missing that change management could bring to the table. And I found that story repeated pretty much in every area I went to afterwards. So, I would look at how service providers would be brought into an organization. For instance, if we were outsourcing a particular piece of work, you would find that organizations will go, well, I'm paying them, so therefore they've got all of the responsibility. But what they'd forget is they'd have the risk was not being managed. If they didn't deliver to the standard you expected, well, then you both fail. So managing that relationship became quite important. So this notion of coming together to co-create and knowing your responsibilities and holding people to account in that relationship became really kind of fundamental to a lot of the work that I do now. And I truly believe like a lot of that is the change management aspect of what leaders bring. But I think a couple of the points that have been made so far, like COVID for me, has been really interesting to see how it's worked even better. Like there were so many great examples already about how that forcing of people to have to confront a situation, and what really made it work was kind of leaders just getting out of the way and letting people get on. Right, not feeling like they had to control how that was going to work, actually just letting people figure out what would work and then empowering them. That's sort of like really been shone a light on where success has been created. And I think that's what we've been doing in pockets in every project I've worked on, is say, leaders, when you bring your people together, make sure you've given them some focus and commonality about the work they're expected to do. You've set clear expectations. But what happens is in the hubbub of normal business, that kind of focus gets dissipated the moment those people leave the room and they get on with their day jobs. And what we've seen through COVID is that hubbub is now starting to merge, feed its way back in. We're starting to get into okay, we've dealt with this for a while now. And this is why we're not going to get that sustaining unless leaders continue. So I'm like, look, it's really interesting hearing so many different stories about how people are making it work, but how they're also starting to suffer from that ability to sustain. So I'm just fascinated by this topic of how do you co-create stuff? How do you collaborate with people, particularly when you come from different backgrounds? You see it everywhere in every organization. It's a really important topic to tackle.
Thank you, Kat. So my first experience of working in a sort of partnership environment was in a very high profile public-private partnership, which started off as it was a strategic partnership. So it was a local authority that procured and got BT in as a partner to deliver various back office functions. And started off, I applied to go and work there because of that curiosity of I was working in the council at the time, and I thought this is going to be very different. It's going to be very fast paced. And at first it was quite an exciting place to work. But actually, it did come to an end, that partnership, and did go quite horribly wrong. And on reflection, when I look back, I think a lot of that was an almost blindness to the culture clash between the two organisations. So you have, you know, public sector staff with public sector values that, you know, care about making a difference to the community, and then you've got private sector where the perception was, and it wasn't true in a lot of the cases, but there was a perception that it was, you know, very driven by profit margins, by numbers, by performance. And actually, both of those two stereotypes were at the extreme end. And in reality, people are people, and most people go to work wanting to do a good job, regardless of what sector they work in. But I found that as something that was particularly fascinating, that I think the railroad into success with it just perhaps didn't take on board that difference in culture. I'm quite curious, Karen, because I know you're working in, it's not public and private, but they are two different sectors. The healthcare and local government are very different, speak a different language. How do you find that? Do you find that there are differences in culture, and what have you learned from that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting. It's the language we speak more than anything. I think it's as we kind of start to talk, health can talk in a health language, and county council can speak in a council language, and actually you're trying to do the same thing, but the language is different. And actually, when you get down to the nub of it, you need to really understand what that organisation and those senior leaders' values are, what they're striving to do, and you'll see a lot of synergy in some of the ambition between health and social care. And it's actually really breaking down that understanding. I think one of the key points I've learned as a senior leader is about listening, but really listening with fascination. I think, you know, which is what Michael West says, it's really important that you do listen and understand what people are saying, and actually you do something with that information. And we work really hard to work together across health and social care. And our third sector partners are really to enable them to have those same conversations and be on equal footing. It's really easy to kind of dismiss that, and it's hard to work at it and really bring people in and also make them feel part of that conversation as well. I think culture is different. I think, you know, we need to understand what each other's priorities are as well, and listen and accept that other organisations have challenges, recognise that and work with it and see how you can support as partners. And we've done a lot of that, particularly through COVID, you know, and it has actually, I think, given a greater understanding of some of the complexities in which we work with statutory organisations, statutory bodies, reporting to different structures and you know, different regulators, which can make it really difficult at times. And you know, as senior leaders change, I think what you know, from my perspective, and we have had senior executive change over this last period. If your ambition's true, your aims are there, people can recognise and link into them. That's really, really important.
Thank you. And Ket, how have you found that sort of clash of culture of different organisations?
You know, as Karen was talking, I was thinking about a housing association I worked with, which, you know, if you forget, even inside your own organisation, sometimes there is a different cultural dynamic. There are different aspects of how people work and how their teams operate together. I was running a workshop for an organisation, a housing association, where their goal, the exec goal for a number of the teams, was to improve the renting rate. So when a property came up, like, they wanted to make sure that the service of that property and the readiness of that property and the marketing of that property came back into circulation quicker. And it cut across 5 or 6 different teams. So one of the things I asked the exec was, you know, what have you done to look at the process end to end? And they brought me in to actually look at what the to-be process was. And I actually wanted to understand what the process today was. So I spent some time talking with each of the different departments, and they had this really different view of what the problems in other departments were. And they'd never had a conversation about it. So one of the things, like, I have been, but I will be honest, I've run this, when I did a merger, I brought a few different teams together and I let them duke it out, right? And I didn't facilitate it particularly well, and it ended like a car crash. So I didn't want to repeat that. What my lesson there was to make sure I understood what some of the pet peeves of one another's were in this end-to-end process. And so I had an idea of what would come up. When I brought them together, they couldn't wait to talk to one another about some of those challenges, to facilitate that conversation. The exec had no idea that some of the touch points that were so heavy, they had a reason for them to be heavy. And actually, they were very much focusing about the handoffs and not how smooth those handoffs were. They were like, I've done my bit of work, go. And so bringing that team around the process end to end and looking at one another's pain points and how they work and giving some understanding really built some real credibility amongst the team to improve it. They actually came up with 7 different ideas and they wanted to take it to the exec team to say, this is what we want to do. So one of the things that was really powerful is, you know, like we all bring our own working practices to conversations and they're there for a reason. But if we don't tell others why they are that way and we don't listen to others and understand, we can never kind of really collaborate effectively. And I think that's the point we often miss. And that really kind of reminded me that, you know, it is a really difficult thing to facilitate dialogue between different teams who are very busy all the time. They've got their own, you know, work to get on every day, and you're asking them to stop, think, and consider working differently with other people when what they do today works for them. It may not work for the overall process, but it works for them. And that, you know, it's a privilege to be in a position of that, to do that. But I think that's a really difficult thing to do. You really have to work at, you know, understanding people, really, like you said, listening to them. So yeah, I think that's what's happening more and more at the moment is, you know, people are wanting to come together and figure out why these problems exist. It's sustaining that kind of desire is I think the challenge.
Thank you, Kate. And I can certainly relate to that. We've done some work in setting up shared services around adoption processes between different councils. We did one with 6 different councils, and our starting point was very much get the social workers from the adoption teams of each of those 6 in a room to actually look at and uncover what are the things that are done differently. And even though that is quite a heavily regulated process, there are still different judgments made, different timescales of things. So it was really, really crucial to do that with the people on the ground that were delivering that service. And I think that's something that is often forgotten. Often kind of mergers and partnerships are agreed in boardrooms, and the very practical, but what will be different, how will we work together, is sometimes missed. Georgia, you've experienced not the different sectors, but certainly bringing together lots of organisations. How did you manage that? How people work and those kind of conversations? So,
in terms of how people work and how they viewed the merger, well, it wasn't a merger, it was a new council, and actually we had to be really careful. I just fell into the trap of using the M word. It wasn't a merger, it was creating a new council. And we found that culturally people's views, residents and staff, were almost quite mirrored, really, in that you've got a very historical old towns of Christchurch and Poole, a lot of history, 2,000 years old, and then you've kind of got this relative upstart of Bournemouth in the middle, which is only a couple of 100 years old as a town, which is really, really young, but had somehow become the bigger of the 3, somehow become the more well-known of the 3. And there was a real sense amongst residents, particularly of Christchurch and Poole. Bournemouth residents were relatively relaxed, actually, but from Christchurch and Poole, that it was a Bournemouth takeover. And you also got that sense from staff that you know, it was everything would be the Bournemouth way. And it was really important that when we spoke with staff about this, we would say, we are all moving into a new council. These colleagues coming into our team, they're not coming into our team, we're all moving into one new team in the new council. And it sounds subtle difference, but it was really, really important that we maintained that language. And so in terms of the service changes, obviously councils have hundreds and hundreds of services, and we would have service leads, so we would have groups of services. Every service colleague from each council that was involved would work together to shape how that service would be. So there would be an analysis of how do they do X service delivery or X process in Poole? How do they do it in Bournemouth? How do they do it in Christchurch or Dorset, depending what the service was? Let's have an open discussion about how that's going to work. What are the pros and cons of each of them? Which is best? Which is most efficient? What digital platforms are they using? How is that consistent across the board? Bearing in mind we had 13 months, and effectively the goal for day one of the council was get it legally created and make sure nothing breaks. That was literally it, because we didn't have time to do a lot of the cultural piece. We didn't have time to align a lot of services. We just had to have a way of doing it on day one. But they were very much owned by the services themselves, and every service had to produce a decision record, which they'd all signed up to across the organisation, the preceding organisations, which would then go up to the board for sign-off and agreement.
Thank you. I think you touch on a really important point there about identity, and I think again, when we were working with different organisations coming together, we're often working with staff who had maybe worked for that organisation for a lot of years and felt a great sense of pride in that, you know, I am an employee of such and such a council and I'm a resident of that area and this is part of who I am, and I think that goes quite deep. And I think it was a great idea to form it as a new council. The partnership that we set up between six was a hosted model, so it was a new identity, but it was hosted by one of the councils. But we were always very careful in our language there that the hosting was just the legal model. The actual service itself was a shared ownership between all of the authorities involved. How did you get around that sense of identity of people, you know, kind of going from one organisation to another? Did you celebrate that? Did you how did you go about that?
Yeah, well, it all started in a name, you know, and what's in a name, and that was one of the most challenging things to agree and come up with for the new council, because there was suggestions that, you know, it has a completely different name, a new name, you know, something like Wessex, something like Poole Bay, something new. Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole has been adopted as the name, but we shortened that to BCP. Not just because Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole is a real mouthful, but because actually there was genuine concern amongst residents and, again, also staff, that it would just get shortened to Bournemouth, and all of a sudden it would just be, people would just say Bournemouth Council, and it's not just Bournemouth. Bournemouth has 190,000 residents. Well, our new area has 400,000. So, you know, it's definitely not just Bournemouth. And so that's why, you know, that name was really, really important. People hated BCP. I understand why. BCP, what does that mean? It's a bit meaningless. But we took it as, you know, the lesser of the two evils at the time. It was new. There was a bit of intrigue about it. We could explain it. We could describe it in that sense. So that was really, really important that we got a name that would work. In terms of day one of the things people were worried about was what would change on day one, and actually the main aim was that not really very much changed on day one. Services would carry on, and you would get the services that you were used to receiving in the same way you were used to receiving them. So actually the day one campaign that we did was very much focused on alleviating those worries. We called it Here for You on day one. And that play on day one, which, you know, when you say, oh, it's been there since day one, there's a sense of continuity as well, which we were trying to pull in. And we use staff for that. You know, they tell the story best. So right through from, you know, a beach cleaner to a registrar to an occupational therapist. I think we had about 20 in the end, staff talking about how they are here. I'm here for you on day one. It was a great way of showcasing the vast range of things that local councils do. Very rarely do you get a platform to say, look, all this stuff that we do. You know, it would be classed as very, very self-indulgent. You wouldn't just do that normally. But it was actually really important for day one to get that across. And so that's how we did it. We used staff, we made a big deal of them, and we tried to have a message behind it, which was about not necessarily celebrating that we created this council, but actually what was important to local people was that it was service continuity, it wasn't disruption, and they shouldn't worry.
Thank you. Ket, have you come across that as a challenge of people's sense of identity? being quite fixed to an organisation and that being a barrier.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to sort of maybe pick up on a point Georgia was raising around sort of that, not forgetting what isn't changing as well. Like, I think, you know, like that is such an important thing that you did, that was reassuring people that although change is happening, there is many things that you can hold onto, and we're still expecting to deliver, and we will continue to. So come and ask us for support. I really think that sometimes we focus so much on managing people through the change, we forget that some reassurance is given by reminding them of what they will continue to keep. And I think that's you really well demonstrated by just the things you do on day one. Yeah, just to that kind of commonality. I might just use the example of what the Institute have been through recently, right? We're all a bunch of volunteers, and we work to deliver events across the country. And everything we used to do was focused on bringing people together physically. And much of, you know, a volunteer, a chapter lead's purpose was in helping create that local community and creating that platform for themselves. And in essence, the moment we went virtual, kind of some of that identity got lost, because it was really, we're producing a series of programs to meet our members' needs, and the chapter, the locality, the bringing together of that community kind of lost its edge for the lead. So, of course, for the first instance, we focused on what the outcome needed to be, which was to continue to deliver, you know, content for our members. But of late, what we've really started to look at is, okay, so what does it mean for us as a group of practitioners who previously spent our time building physical networks, to now thinking about how do we serve, you know, both ourselves as individuals and what we want out of it, but also to continue to serve the community that we're here for in different ways. And so, you know, again, it kind of came back to, you know, you do what must be done to start with, but you can't forget that people are losing something, right? And you have to address that need. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about what it is that brings us together, that is abstracted from you know, doing physical events. You know, why do we do what we do? But we also thought about what do people need out of that. So, you know, that sense of identity was not only a common group of, you know, a sense of identity, how are we as a group, but also what do I need from this individually? And that for me has been sort of how we've managed to sustain the momentum of what we want to do. Is we had to focus as a group on what needed to be done, and then move to what is it that we individually need, and that continues to serve that overall goal whilst meeting my needs as well. And I think that's sort of like, it's the progression that most organizations try to make, but often get lost at that point of, we've done the change, now we need to sustain the change. And that's where I think, you know, we you know, hopefully are sort of starting to get into that area of sustaining.
Thank you. And Karen, I know that your work is not a merger, it's not a legal entity as such, but I wondered, have you had to kind of address a transition from an us and them into a we in terms of approach, and have you experienced that at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think even in our title, which is Bay Health and Care Partners, some, you know, when I first came, people were, what's that? Who are they? What do they do? You know, and it is really difficult when you're a partnership to find an identity really. And I think if you bring it back to your personal identity, how do you identify yourself? You know, my substantive role is with the NHS. I joined the NHS because I wanted to improve the health of our local population. And you'll get people's own identity and then the organisation that they work in. And we've had some challenges in the Bay over the years in terms of some of the services we have delivered, which haven't always been at the highest standard. And people can attach something to that as well. So how do you bring together organisations who've been challenged at times to have that identity that you want to be together? And we've worked hard on that, but it goes back to your core values. What are your values as a person? What are your values as your organisation? And what are those values you're trying to come together as well? And it also, you know, just picking up on what Ket's been talking about, some of the behaviours that people, senior leaders, and also teams within teams. I was really interested about those teams where other parts of the organisation didn't realise what's their identity, and how do you then make them all go to the kind of strategic identity that you're trying to create. It's difficult, but I think if you try to bring it back to values, What is our aim? What is our ambition? What are we trying to do? And what's the value of coming together as a partnership? Because there's got to be an outcome to that. The so what? What difference will it make that you're working together? And that's been hard to really try to say. So what will be different? And so and having some real outcomes focused ambition around what you're trying to do I think will support your identity. For us is to be a partnership that creates a much better environment for our population, and they've got a better sense of health and well-being.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, but it's very closely linked with my next question, which is I sometimes find in my work that when setting up partnerships or mergers, the starting point for the conversation is often about money and resources. And I always try and resist that, because I think that's the worst possible starting point. I think your starting point needs to be, what have we got in common? What are we trying to achieve? And I actually think that's what's accelerated things with COVID, because it stopped those kind of system-based conversations and forced a conversation of, right, how are we going to keep people safe? How are we going to enable people who are shielding to get food deliveries? It became a much more value-based conversation. Lizzie's asking for Karen, but I'd love to hear views from everybody on the panel. Has there been barriers around shared budgets, and have you found, as I found in the past, that sometimes starting with that actually creates a big delay and you're almost better off avoiding it until it's a bit more well-formed?
So finance is always difficult, isn't it? Particularly in a financially challenged environment that we're currently in. And do we have shared budgets across the system? No, not in that way. But how do we align some of the things we're doing to invest in the same thing together? And we have what's called the Better Care Fund in Lancashire, which is a joint kind of fund between health and care. And we work really hard to prioritise how we spend that money to improve our population's health. We're not there yet in terms of shared budgets, because as I said originally, we are statutory organisations. What we try to do is align our spend to improve aspects of the health and care of our populations, really. And we'll get that now as we're in COVID, and every winter, actually. It's every winter we come together as health and care providers to say, how do we support our populations through winter? What do we need to focus on, and what can we do together? And then align the way we spend our money to do that, really. And that's what we strive to do in terms of that sharing budgets. We don't have a single budget though for health and care. That would be lovely. Thank you.
Ket, I know you've worked on projects where it's been almost customer and supplier based. So I'm sure that finance is always a key starting point there. How have you found conversations around budgets and money, and do you think they've helped or hindered?
I mean, they absolutely hinder collaboration for a start, right? Like the moment you start on a conversation around what have we got to spend, you kind of start already cutting at what am I going to be able to commit. So yeah, actually a role I was playing for a consultancy firm a while ago was kind of a quasi product manager. So we're bringing in third-party technology services to bolt onto some internal work, and like the people you're bringing in have expertise. They really know what can get to the grips with what your business is trying to do with their service. So valuing that and getting them to understand your business is kind of like a great way to build a partnership and a shared model. And I always, with my project management hat, I always used to see budget as a risk factor. Like, someone's paying some money to get a service. We want the best service we can get, but let's not talk about money. Let's look at what the opportunities are here, right? And see what options we have to bring that service in. We've got probably the very basic all the way up to the bells and whistles. And somewhere in amongst that, our budget sits, right? Somewhere in amongst that, there is somewhere we are happy to commit. Now, there are trade-offs to doing that. And I've never been in a position to say, we're going to pick this one, but I have been in a position to say, here's the range of options you've got, person whose budget it is, right? So which one are you most happy? Where would you like to place risk? We may not be able to deliver that, but you definitely get this bit. So for me, the conversation has always been a non-starter the moment you start talking about money. It's not that you can avoid it, But once you have a collaborative kind of relationship with your supplier, the people you're merging, the teams that are trying to work together, you can present options that give different opportunities for people who have got the budget. And again, it's up to them to make a decision, right? Like, so I always think about, what is a leader there to do? Secure me some funds, give me unblock the roadblocks that might be laying ahead, and make decisions where trade-offs need to be made. And so what I always try with the work I do when bringing service providers in, when thinking about mergers and acquisitions, when doing kind of team collaboration, is what's our common purpose? We've talked about that a lot. What values drive us? What is our common purpose? What is our outcome, our collective outcome? And therefore, how do we present a range of options which enable that based on the constraints we have to manage, and finance is only one constraint we have to manage. So that for me is always, it's never great to start with budget, but you have to bring them in at some point, and it's always a risk mitigation strategy.
Thank you. Georgia, I imagine it's slightly different picture because it was a whole organisation thing. Did you find conversations about finance were difficult?
Not really. Ultimately, one of the main aims of the creation of the two new councils was a financial case. It wasn't just a financial case, but that was a huge driver of it. Well over £100 million saved in the first 7 years. But actually, with the budget pressures from COVID, that almost doesn't seem that amazing now. But it clearly set the baseline for us being able to weather those better than we would have been if we'd been separate organisations. Everyone's budgets would transfer to the new council. So in that sense, it wasn't difficult. Probably the area that was most, not contentious, but which needed attention was the Christchurch part for Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, because that was a two-tier structure. So most of the services there were provided by Dorset County Council previously. And it was about 11% of the residents, 11% of their budget. Now, for some services, like what we do in comms, back office functions, you can just transfer 11% of the budget. That was pretty easy. But for other services, it was more complicated. So things like adult social care, there was a higher proportion of higher dependency service users in Christchurch compared to other areas in Dorset. So actually, 11% wouldn't have covered the service needs that the new council would have been picking up on day one. It would have been higher, and we would have been a financial disadvantage straight away. So that was probably the most complicated aspect of what do we do about the budget for Christchurch to make sure that the new council has got the money to continue providing those services on day one in the way that people are currently or were at that point receiving them. So that was probably the most difficult bit, I would say.
Thank you. One of the things that we always made sure that we kept doing consistently throughout any sort of partnership process was that kind of update and communications to staff. And I know, Georgia, that's your profession. Do you have any advice for people about communicating? I know we've talked a bit about identity. Do you have any other advice about communicating with people that are going through that kind of merger or partnership situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, having a clear aim, being clear, what is it we're aiming for, what is the goal, what is the deadline. And actually, in a sense, although this was a huge program, it was pretty simple. It was creating two new councils, providing all local government services in the area that would come into being on the 1st of April 2019. So in terms of defining where we're all going, it was, it sounds so much simpler than the actual process for getting there, which was not simple at all. So constantly reminding people that was where we were aiming, why we were doing it, what the savings would be, what the benefits for residents and service users in the area would be. And also for staff, being clear that staff were shaping the services for day one. The people who knew the service best, the subject matter experts, they were the ones doing it. They were the ones shaping it. It wasn't being, driven down from above, how that happened. So that communication was absolutely critical. We had communication leads, we had champions. I know it's such an overused phrase, but we did have champions across the organisations who were like those trusted voices. for services to feed things back up to the organisation that wouldn't necessarily get raised, not necessarily HR things, but they might be HR things, they might be service related things, they might be leadership things, they might be values based things, but we're able to raise that in a way that gave staff a bit more of a voice than they might have had in terms over and above services. More about that organisational culture, because again we'd had Poole and Christchurch had quite clearly defined values. Bournemouth Council didn't actually have any stated values. So you had three very different cultures in that respect coming together. So involving staff in developing those values, about what was this new organisation all about? What was important to us about how we worked, how we wanted to be, and what we were there to do.
Thank you. I love champions. I use them in nearly all my projects. I just think it's a really great way of connecting with frontline staff and actually nurturing some leadership skills. I think they're really great. Karen, how have you found communication?
I'd just like to resonate completely with what Georgia said. I think a couple of years ago we did a really big piece of work around integration of our community service teams into with the acute services, and I would just say communicate and then communicate again. I don't think you can do enough communication, and it is really important that the teams are really hearing the same message. What's the importance of this? Why are we doing it, and what difference would it make? And again, going back to what Ket said, what will be the same? Will it change my day-to-day, the way I work with on the front line? And often it doesn't change, but actually it's really important that you communicate that and really understand and talk to your staff in particular around, why we're doing this and why it's important. And also just going back to identity, again, just going back to what Georgia said, the values of different organisations, both the organisations had a really strong value set, both of which have been developed by the staff, which is really important. And so a lot of the ambition was the same, but the words were slightly different. So how do you align that and make sure that everybody can, again, it still rings true to them? So I think for me, communication is so important, and sometimes we get it wrong. So how do we learn to make sure that we do communicate the right message and remain consistent, and that every person, wherever you are in an organisation or in a community, you understand what that is, and keep it simple. I would say keep it simple.
Definitely, thank you. Ket, I know you're a huge fan of co-design, which I think is a brilliant way to just start off that communication process and that conversation, really. Do you have any advice for people about communicating with their teams and colleagues as they go through something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with a PR expert on another program at the moment. And one of the things she mentioned the other day, that kind of, you need to hear a message 7 times before it really sinks in. I don't know where the study that purports that comes from, but it's kind of well known in PR circles that, you're keeping messages simple, repeating them, even if they to you are a bit boring, right? Like not everyone's in the same space as you. What it made me really think about, and I think I kind of recognize in sort of many aspects of the way we communicate with people, is like what we're trying to do is we're trying to manage expectations. We're trying to tell people what is coming and then try and understand what they've interpreted from that, and then try and keep them on the same path. If it's not where we want, we need to manage their expectation. And that is, from a project perspective, communication is seen as almost like a one-way fire and forget type thing. But from a business change perspective, from a leadership perspective, it is about understanding what your people think are coming and managing expectations around it. They might think what you've said means one thing, and it could mean completely another. And the longer you leave that, the longer you're building up a problem for someone who's going to push against it. And this is, I'm hugely interested in where resistance comes from within projects, whether it's historical resistance, whether it's just a cynicism about leadership, whatever it is. I always genuinely believe a lot of it has come down to a mismanagement of expectation. What was said was going to happen? How true was it when it was followed through? And did it actually deliver what I thought I took away from it? And that for me is kind of the commonality of why communication is so important in anything we kind of do. Have we made clear to others, what we expect of them, what they can expect of us, and are we staying aligned on that all the time? And which is why communication remains to be sort of fundamental to business change. You know, that is ultimately what helps people get in their head, you know, getting ready for that change, getting behaviorally, emotionally ready for that change, is sort of constantly being kind of assessed around, do I understand what's coming? And, you know, with limited time, that's really difficult. You know, a lot of the people we're trying to impact already are working at 100% to do what they're doing today. And now we're giving them something else to think about. So yeah, for me, it's always been about keeping it simple, you know, managing expectations through the communications. That's a primary goal for me, at least. And sort of trying to weed out where people are feeling like they don't know what's coming. They don't know what's happening. They need a little bit of extra support. Where is that intervention going to come from?
Thank you, Kat. And I think you're right, that understanding where people think, what people think is happening is really important. We actually did about 2 or 3 weeks ago with one of our clients a little online just quiz that was, what do you think will be different 12 months from now, with like multiple choices, some of which were right and some of which were red herrings, to test that understanding. And it wasn't as strong actually as the leaders in that organisation felt, which means that we're now repivoting and being a bit more practical in terms of what we're communicating will be different. But one thing I have taken from this call, because I always chase what will be different, I think it's, there's lots of change management models and tools you can use, but if you can answer the question what will be different from different perspectives, then you're probably doing okay. But I don't ask what will be the same, so I'm definitely going to take that away. We do have a question from Rebecca, which I'll open to the whole panel, whoever'd like to take it. Have you ever tried to bring two organisations together with different levels of change maturity?
Yes, I mean I think every project I've worked on, change maturity is sort of they're always different, because people are coming at it from different perspectives. So there might be a readiness for change inherently, sort of people have, and I think that's quite personalized sometimes. Like, we can, I can adopt something into my own personal life much more quickly if I've asked for it, or if I'm really committed to it, than maybe if it's thrown upon me, right? And that's a kind of standard sort of, principle of change management. People don't like change being done to them. But I think what happens in teams is that kind of like co-creation, that support for one another, that cohesion is not always the same. And that for me is what sort of underpins sort of change readiness or resilience for a team to work effectively. And I think it's different just depending on the nature of the role they do. So actually many operational teams are really quite adept at sudden dramatic change, because they like fires, they like operationally putting stuff out, fixing problems, but sustaining it takes a very different mindset. And actually that's where sort of change capability is, I think everybody has it. What they use it for is very different, and actually pulling on the right levels to sustain a change is very different than dealing with an immediate problem. So I think, there's some different elements of what we mean by maturity. I actually don't like, we have a maturity model, but it implies someone's immature, right, by using the word maturity. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's just, what are you ready for? What has your past experience enabled you to cope with change today? And how do you leverage that to take you forward? So maturity is one way of describing it, but I think it is about kind of what has your change experience enabled you to deliver, and what do you need next? What are the capabilities that you're requiring to navigate the next change? And that's where a lot of the work of the Institute is about building individual capability. What experience have you got today, and how does that help you? And what do you need for the sorts of changes you might embark on in the future? And where can learning from other practitioners help you with that? So it's about capability, less about kind of saying that someone's, a level of maturity.
I think that's a really good point, Kat. And when I was working in the public-private partnership, I'm not sure if maturity is the right word or what the right word is, but the private sector partner had been through a procurement process, which had taken a long time because it was a very valuable partnership. And so you had a group of people there that had been working on this for a significant amount of time, that were driven, that had to go through a competitive process in order to win it. And, you know, speaking as a business owner that goes through procurement processes, it takes a huge amount of energy to get through that process, and a huge amount of thought. So they were in a place on day one of that partnership where they'd been working on this for a long time already, even though it was day one. And the model that they went for was that a number, I think it was about 1,200 staff from within the council, were then seconded into this partnership, where they suddenly had these new private sector leaders and managers who they had no relationship with. They were not prepared for that journey in the same way. So you could see where that clash happened pretty much almost straight away. And actually, I don't know if that's maturity or if it's just they were at a very different point on that journey of this really was day one to them, whereas the other party, it was not day one at all. How about you, Karen? Maybe it's not maturity, but it might be just a kind of different place in the journey between organisations. Have you picked up on that, or consistent?
I've not got the experience that Kat has, but I suppose in terms of maturity, we have looked at, you know, working with our partners, where are they in the journey of developing that stronger partnership? And again, it goes back to what the aims are, how we can be mutually beneficial to work together for our communities. Are our aims correct? And I suppose, you know, as we've seen partners, our partnership grow, you can see how more engaged the partnership is, because we've got a common vision, a common aim, and that's really developed over time. And I would say now we've got a partnership that is mature. I don't like that word either, Ket, really, because, you know, everybody wants to be involved for their communities. But I think we've not done a formal exercise around that to look at where organisations are. But I think you can also see that in the way that people engage with the programme of work that we're doing, whether people you know, come and engage in different conversations. And I would say within Morecambe Bay, we've really started to strengthen that now, and we've got really good collaboration and co-production with a lot of the work that we're doing within Morecambe Bay.
Thank you. Georgia, so many different organisations involved. They must have been at different points on that journey. They must have been in different places. Did you find that?
Yeah, I did find that. I think what I wanted to say, though, was actually pick up on what Ket said about sustainability, because I think creating the new council was effectively the first change. That was almost the easy bit, because it was almost a bit of a legal process. The bit we're on now is still on, 18 months in, not for all services, but still for some, is actually that service harmonisation, different ways of doing things, different picking a process, a supplier. You know, if you've got refuse trucks, for example, you can't just say we're going to get rid of all those refuse trucks and get these other refuse trucks in, because it's a different refuse collection system, it's a different style of design of how the waste goes into the truck, etc., etc. So all those things, they are still ongoing. Not some of them are finished, some of them are not. And that's before we move into our new operating model and our actual organisation design, which is something we're currently procuring a strategic partner for at the moment. So we know we will be more data driven, it will be enterprise level, it will be customer focused, it will be digital where we can, and that is a level that is just starting to come on stream for our staff to get their heads around. Things like our office and accommodation strategy. At the moment, obviously we're all at home, but prior to that, we still had 3 offices. People were, on the whole, going and working where they'd always worked. Of course, the strategy always was to rationalise that. When actually COVID has accelerated that. It's given us the space to reconfigure one of our office locations to become the main civic centre much quicker than we would have done otherwise, because why wouldn't we when there's hardly anybody there? It's just those levels of change. It's the goalposts aren't moving. It always would have had to do organisational design. We always would have had to come up with what operating model is going to be. But because we had 13 months to create a council, we couldn't have done that in the time. We almost had to change the timetable completely. The plan was we did all of this up front. We had elections a year ahead. We got the political impetus. We set the culture. We did, all that stuff. But we've had to turn it on its head. So a lot of the stuff we're doing now, once the council's created, you wouldn't ideally do it after you've created the organisation. So it's that sustainability of change and that that resilience to permanent change that we're dealing with at the moment. And I have to say, people are maybe it is the culture, maybe but people are going with it. People are embracing it. People are getting that this is part of what we're all about now.
Thank you.
Go on, Lucy, I just wanted, something struck me as you were talking, Georgia, as well, because I think something that, like there's this notion of like the burning platform. What is it that's going to bring our organization under, right? And prior to COVID, most organizations talked about a burning platform, but rarely was it imminent. Rarely was it something that was going to happen 6 months, 12 months, even 3 months, right? It was something that if we don't do 3 years down the line, we're just not going to be relevant. That isn't hot enough. It's not close enough to people to feel. And I think what COVID for me has realized is we talk about a burning platform, but we rarely ever at an organizational level create the heat of that, whatever it is that's gonna break. And the example you gave is you had 13 months to put a new structure in place. There was no question about needing to do that. And so everything became focused around that goal. And now, you've built a coalition of people that understand that and now are committed to do the stuff that comes after it. What happens in most organizations is they do the opposite. They put the goal out in front and they say, we're going to tackle this slow over time. And lo and behold, it drags and it never goes anywhere. And people are still wedded and committed to what they do. So this burning platform notion is like really powerful, but it's been really poorly used in the past because it's sort of like, here's this thing off in the distance that's really important, we must do, and if we don't do, we won't exist. But don't worry, we're not going to tackle it right now. We've got to figure out all these other little things. It's it's the thing that holds people back. And funnily enough, you just gave a great example where it actually propelled people forward, and COVID's done the same thing, right? Like, I think it's so important to kind of recognize that you really do need to create some sort of immediate challenge that the whole organization faces and that pulls together around, and then you can figure stuff out after that, right?
It's what in comms we call the compelling narrative.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right, and I think that COVID as well was a very personal burning platform. I think in local government where I work, the burning platform for the last number of years has been very much financially based. But that's people that go and work in local government are often not financially driven people. A social worker doesn't really want to hear about that we've got to save another 3 million off a budget. It doesn't mean anything to that person. So I think that communicating in a way that's meaningful is really crucial. And I think what COVID did was it hit everybody in some way. And one of the lessons we learned from our early conversations like this was basically how crucial that sense of shared purpose is. And what COVID did do is it gave a very clear sense of purpose, whether it was, right, we all need to be able to work from home 3 days from now, or we all need to make sure that we can get food to people that can't get out and do their own shopping. There were very tangible, clear things that needed to be done, which I think we often I see people communicate in change programs like project managers. We communicate milestones. That doesn't mean anything to the average person. I think, and like you were saying, Georgia, it was just very simple. By this date, we have to be going live on day one as a legal entity. It was something very concrete and clear. We have a really good question from the chat, which is, have you faced any extreme level of resistance from key stakeholders where communication, bringing people together for a facilitated discussion did not help and had to really think out of the box to get buy-in? Does anybody want to take that?
I will, because I like I don't know how easy this truly is, but I've seen it work. I think we always think that when you meet resistance, right, the only answer is you have to somehow quash and convert the resistance to some level of adoption and support. And that is obviously the goal, right? Like, people are resistant because they've either got experiences where it's not good for them, they're going to personally lose out, right? They're all really important things to understand. But there are some people who are genuinely resistant to what is going on. They don't buy into it. They don't think this is the right thing to be doing. And I think, I read this quote from a practitioner based in Australia, and it was like, if you can't change the person, change the person. Like, if the person isn't right for the organization, or it's not for you anymore, then maybe the right thing to do is step aside. Don't keep feeling this level of resistance that you're putting on yourself, that you don't fit into the organization, that your ideas aren't listened to. I mean, don't take that lightly. It's not, we could that's an acceptable answer for everybody that might push against what you think is the right thing to do. But I do think an output should sometimes be, what I have in mind is, I genuinely believe the best thing. I've listened to everybody's views and you still don't buy into it. Well, maybe that it's not right for us to be working together anymore. And I think we don't pull that lever sometimes. We kind of continue to allow that negative conversation around where we want to go in the future to exist, because we feel like we have to convert everybody. And you know what? The thing is that in reality, a lot of people will probably, as you transcend more into operational roles away from leadership, people will just get on, because they'll grumble about what is being done. Maybe they haven't had enough input. Those are things we can attack. But, the more senior those people are, the more obstructive it becomes, and the more important it is to take those important decisions. Like, the reason I really have seen this work is where there was a stakeholder who had a lot of influence over the direction of the program, but had zero, resource committed. Like, they were impacted, and they had a very good relationship with a lot of the other sponsors. But one of my recommendations was to remove that person from being on the steering group, because they weren't positively impacting the direction of what we wanted to do. In fact, they were coming up with roadblocks. They were calling out things that weren't issues and making them to be bigger. So they were becoming kind of blockers for us. And so highlighting that and saying, maybe it's not right for this person to be involved because it's not aligned to what they want to do, and maybe there's other things they should be doing, was absolutely, the best way of turning it around. It's not an easy conversation. I think, it's easy to avoid, because nobody wants to be that person who wants to be removed or has to step away. But I think it has to be an option we consider, right, and we actually apply more often.
Thank you, Kat. I just want to say that there is something about listening as well, and I have been the person, despite the fact I have built a business in change. I love change. I remember years ago in a job, there was a kind of centralisation. I was a finance and business manager in a traded service within a council, and there was a programme of centralisation, which, since this day when I was massively resistant, I've led similar programs. But there was this program of bringing together anybody that was to do with business or finance and putting them in the central hub of a large county council. And I fought that tooth and nail, because I felt very, very strongly that as a traded service, it was really important that there was somebody who was responsible for finance and income generation and that kind of commercial skill that wasn't needed in other parts of the council, but in that particular part where we had to generate income to cover our own costs, it was crucial. So I've been on both sides of the fence, and I won that battle at the time and stayed within the service, and we turned that service around from losing money to generating quite significant profits for the council. So I think there is something about listening on a one-on-one basis. Sometimes dealing with resistance in a kind of group facilitation is challenging, but actually getting to that person and really understanding, because they might be right. They might actually be resisting because it's not a good idea. And I think that's always an important first step. I am with Ket that sometimes it's not solvable, and sometimes somebody's values are just not aligned anymore. But I do always promote that one-on-one conversation and be very upfront. You know, I can feel your resistance. Talk to me about it. What is the issue? And sometimes you might uncover something that you weren't aware of. Sometimes it might just be a personal issue. And I have been asked, are you one of these bright young things from the government, by social workers in the past, which I've said, no, I'm not at all. So sometimes there is just a natural resistance to somebody coming in and telling me how to do my job, which, you know, is just people skills and connecting with people to get over that. But I do think it's always important to listen to people that are resistant, just in case you're missing something. And I think turning that conversation around, some of those people, if you listen and understand them, will actually become the biggest advocates once you're on the same side, because in some ways the people that are quietly resistant are more of a problem. The ones that are vocal about it are usually vocal because they care, and the people that care are usually the ones that are very influential in their groups. Does anybody else want to make any comments about dealing with resistance?
Hi Lucy, it's Karen. I think I would support what you've just said. I think to ignore people who are resistant is even worse, because actually you need to really get underneath why the resistance. And you're absolutely right. Some people might have a really compelling narrative that no one's heard or listened to. So I think to ignore that, because actually that could really block a lot of work going forward if you don't actually understand it, talk to the individual, recognise the challenges, and then try and give a consistent view. And actually, like you know, they took your advice and continue to work with you in the way you described. So I think it's really important that we don't ignore that. And actually, what I found, if you do get resistors, they always add good value. Maybe it's an angle you've not thought about, or a group of people or services that you've missed. It's really important that you don't ignore it, is what I would say. You're on mute, Lucy.
Georgia, did you have any issues around resistance?
Probably the most significant for us was the opposition of Christchurch Borough Council. As I've said, Christchurch as a town has got amazing history, over 2,000 years old, very, very proud, and very much as a place, a very different feel to Bournemouth, very much a different feel. And they were so opposed that they actually had a referendum amongst their residents as to whether the council should support or not support this, or what did their residents want. And unfortunately, that referendum wasn't binding. It couldn't veto the creation of the new councils going ahead. But Christchurch Borough Council, I think, felt that their residents did not support it, or a vocal minority of their residents did not support it, depending which side of the line you want to be on. And they had to do what they had to do to show that they were doing all they could to get their residents' voice heard. And I think by holding that referendum, that was their way of saying, we are doing what we can. We are doing all we can to get your concerns raised and elevated, because of course that went up to government. Of course that had to be reported up, because ultimately it was the Secretary of State that decided, yes, these councils are created, or no, they're not. There's a business case put in, but the government were the deciders. So it was really important for the local authority in Christchurch that they did that. Ultimately, it didn't impact on the creation of the councils or on the government's decision in the end. But I think for them and for the councillors who were wanting to continue to stand for election regardless, it was really important for them that they had been seen to act on what they perceived as the wishes of their residents.
Thank you. So we're nearly out of time. So I guess my last question, which I'm getting into the habit of always asking this question now, is if you were training up the next generation of leaders, what key lessons would you give in terms of what skills they need, what they need to be aware of when going into a partnership environment?
I can start if you like. For us, and Ket will like this, one of the most important things was having amazingly strong program and project management, absolute governance to get the change delivered, processes that everybody knew, decision makers who would make decisions, clear governance for who could decide what. So every decision to do with creating the new councils had a decision record. It was uniform, it was recorded, and that was absolutely vital, because that could then form the basis of our communication with residents, with staff, with those delivering the service. With councillors, of course, we could be clear about what had been decided on a case-by-case basis about service delivery. So for this, yeah, definitely strong programme and project management. And of course, I would say communication. And by communication in all its forms, so two-way communication, engagement, listening, brand and identity, absolutely key and critical, and having that compelling story. What are we aiming for? What are we going to achieve? Why is that a good thing? What's the point of this? What's the benefit? Because if you can't articulate that, you will come up more and more against your blockers, and it will help to bring your blockers on side, because you will have a compelling story about what you're going to achieve. So having your compelling story and having a strong program by means of getting there, I would say.
Hi, it's Karen. I would advocate everything that George has said there. Absolutely. I think for me, it's some of the softer skills that people need, you know, to be kind, to listen to people. The relationship side of change is really, really important, and sometimes gets underplayed because it's you can't see it, you can't feel it. Well, you can feel it actually if you get it wrong. So I think the relationship side, being kind, really listening, tenacity. You need to be tenacious, not give up. Sometimes need a thick skin. Recognise that people will struggle with some of this personally as individuals and as organisations, and I think you've got to be empathetic to that. And you'll need really good negotiating skills and be really diplomatic. And I think, but also for you in working in that environment, is to build your own resilience and have a network that you can work with as well to help through this process, because it's really, really important.
Thank you. Kat?
Yeah, I mean, those are great points, really. And I think just picking up on sort of a lot of that, you know, behavioural side, I think when, you know, what I think is absolutely critical is someone who's coming in and trying to build trust amongst the people they're working with. Like, if you're trusted, people will give you a lot of time. So that skill in building relationships is critical. You know, lots of the emotional side of that Karen talked about are foundational, right? You know, being empathetic to people's situations, understanding what challenges they face, really listening to them, right? That's all about building a trusted relationship with others. But, you know, once you have that trusted relationship, you have to continue to work at it. It's like any relationship, like you are continuing to manage expectations, you're talking to one another. That sort of two-way open dialogue is so foundational for any kind of, you know, partnership, relationship, whatever it happens to be. And I think by doing that, you also kind of take accountability of yourself and you give accountability to others. So for me, it's sort of like kind of like, you know, it's a stepping stone. You build relationships, you build trust, you give people clear expectations about what's coming, and you hold people to account. If you do those three things, you know, and you're constantly kind of thinking, am I doing well enough at these three things with everybody I'm working with? I think you've really got the foundations for kind of leading an organization through anything, right? Like, because you're there to support them when they need it, you're there to unblock things when they're ready to go full pelt at something, but it's really about being tuned in to what people need and being there for people and having the relationship for people to come to you. And I think all of those things are about governance and behavior. So yeah, I think those three things for me are kind of key.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to bring it to a close there, because I know a couple of panel members do have an 11:30, so we'll need to shoot off on time. Thank you so much to the panel members and everybody that's taken part in the call for the great questions. It's been a fascinating conversation. As I said at the start, it's my favourite type of work, this. I really love being in this partnership space. We've talked about culture, process, identity, shared values, funding and how that can impact, resistance. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation with me. We would love to keep in touch with everybody on the call. We're on a mission at the moment to make change better and to help organisations do it well. So we'd love to hear from you, any feedback you have. We'd love to hear what future topics you would like us to talk about. And we also are always on the lookout for other panel members. So if you know somebody that's got a great story to tell about change in the workplace, then please do put them in touch with us. We do hold these fairly regularly. We hold them every 3 or 4 weeks. So do let us know if you know anybody. It would be remiss of me to not give the Change Management Institute a plug, given that we have Ket on the call. I've been a member for 2 or 3 years, been to quite a few of their face-to-face events and virtual events. They are a fantastic resource if you are a change manager, and they're not too expensive. I can't remember how much it is, but I'm quite tight with money and I wouldn't have joined if they were a fortune. So please do look into that if you want to be part of that community. They're a great resource for me, and it's always great to meet other people in similar roles facing similar challenges. Do have a look at our website, trumanchange.co.uk. We have an events page on there. We also have a white paper which we've been collating our lessons learnt as part of these conversations. And follow us on social media so you'll get to hear about future events. And if you'd like to talk to us, please do get in touch. Thank you once again to our speakers for sharing your insight. It's been really valuable.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.
Nice
Thanks,
to see
everybody.
everyone.
Cheers for organising. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great weekend. Thank you, guys.